council screening of The Prosecutors Ending Conflict-Related Sexual Violence. We hope you enjoyed the documentary The Prosecutors by director and producer Leslie Thomas. Today's panel discussion will go beyond the documentary in discussing the epidemic case of conflict-related sexual violence at large. Before I introduce our panelists, please take note of a few housekeeping remarks. Today's event is on the record and is being live streamed. We always welcome social media engagement, but please silence your phones. The Council is an independent and non-partisan platform, and views expressed by individuals we host are their own and do not represent institutional positions or views of the Council. Thank you also to our members in attendance today. Your support is critical to our work. If you're not yet a member, please consider joining. We have a wide range of levels for you to choose from. Later, we will be taking audience questions from the room and online at chi.cnf.io. We would also like to take a moment to thank our event partner, Artworks Projects, and our media partner, WBEZ, as well as our outreach partners, all of whom have helped to spread the word and build awareness about today's event. They include, and they're also up here, they include Chicago Bar Association, Human Rights Committee, Heartland Alliance International, International Human Rights Clinic, University of Chicago School of Law, Marjorie Kovler Center, National Immigrant Justice Center, Northwestern Pritzker School of Law, Refugee, School of Social Service Administration, the University of Chicago, and the Voices and Faces Project. Oh, that was a mouthful. Now it is my pleasure to introduce our speakers. All the way on the left-hand side is Patricia Vicious-Sellers. She is a special advisor for gender for the Office of the Prosecutor of the International Criminal Court. She was a prosecutor at the Yugoslav Tribunal from 1994 to 2007 and was a legal advisor for gender at the Rwanda Tribunal from 1995 to 1999. Next to Patricia is Kim Theis-Seelinger. She is the director of the Sexual Violence Program at the Human Rights Center, Berkeley School of Law. Her current work focuses on accountability of wartime sexual violence, protection in humanitarian settings, and the prosecution of international crimes in national courts. Next to her is Leslie Thomas. She is an Emmy Award-winning art director and architect and is the director and producer of The Prosecutors. She is also the founder of Artworks Projects. And lastly, our moderator this evening, Steve Bynum, is a senior producer for Worldview, WBEZ's Global Affairs and News program, and he is the recipient of the Gabriel Award, honoring works of excellence in broadcasting. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our speakers.
Thank you so much. Thank you. First of all, it's a great testament to the compassion and your co-suffering love to come here tonight, because there is a stereotype in our field and international discourse that unless you can make a direct connection to where you live and what's happening in your immediate community, that you may not care. Well, you've all made that into a myth, and the fact that you stayed after the film. And so success for me tonight is that you hear as little from me as possible. And but I do want to start with you, Leslie, because you and I have been friends for many years, and I remember 5-6 years ago, well, even before that, when the idea was, yeah, you're right, when the idea was ginning around in your mind, and you had a very clear vision, and this film is extremely unique. And could you talk about the uniqueness of this film, and then also why you chose Bosnia, Democratic Republic of Congo, and Colombia as your subject matters?
Absolutely, and I just really want to quickly thank Jenna and the Council for hosting the film here. It's a wonderful public place to have it, and we're so thrilled with this audience and these community partners who've really made this a special week in Chicago around this issue. This film was inspired by two things. Artworks Project, since its inception, has worked on grave conflicts that have included, unfortunately, large amounts of conflict-related sexual violence. So we spent years working on projects in the DRC, in Burma, Myanmar, Sudan, other places where we were documenting and leveraging voices of those directly impacted. However, in 2013, Kim called me up and said effectively, would you like to come to Washington, D.C., along with a number of other fantastic colleagues of ours working on gender and security and related topics, and interview those participants for what's called the Missing Piece Symposium. A little bit more on that later. And when I came there, I ended up, along with my colleague Tess Landon, interviewing roughly in 2 days 26 experts from across the spectrum of conflict-related sexual violence. Rolls right off the tongue. In the process of being educated by these incredibly passionate defenders, advocates, survivors, people who document, people who prosecute, so on and so forth, I met Patricia. And Patricia gave a keynote lecture in which she explained that the legal precedent had been set, by and large, across the globe for identifying conflict-related sexual violence and holding perpetrators to accountable. We just needed to do it. And some places were doing it. And then Kim said she would take her camera out and she would take pictures when prosecutors didn't have any paper clips. So I was like, no problem. You guys are busy. We'll make a movie, come back in a year with this film, and you can use it as a tool. That was 2013 for those who were paying attention, and we're done. So really, it was that simple. We wanted to make a tool so that the incredible experts around the world, and when I say experts, I mean everybody involved in this, from those directly impacted because a war is fought in and on their body to those who are supporting that. We really wanted to do that. What we then wanted to do was do it around national mechanisms. So we picked Congo, Colombia, and Bosnia because they offered us 3 different ethnicities, 3 different time frames, 3 different geographies. And that was, yes, to be useful in terms of the learnings, but also to make sure that we as humans never get a chance to do our favorite thing. What is our favorite thing? Ask my kids. We like to other people. It wasn't mine. I didn't do it. She did it. He did it. Somebody else did it. Somebody else always did this. Unfortunately, we have all done this, so that means that we can be part of the solution. That was 6 years.
Wonderful. I wanted to talk about something about the art of the film. I have to say it's one of the most powerful documentaries, that the opening of a documentary that I've ever seen, where you are right there in the faces of the people in the moment. And how did you get that kind of access from the DRC government in order to create those incredible opening shots?
I'll answer it quickly, but then I want to turn to my colleagues here, because really transparency in what you can document for a film or any kind of journalism is about what is our society holding the state accountable to. So in the most fragile country that we documented, the DRC, and I say fragile meaning they're kind of in an aspirationally post-conflict setting, depending on the week, we had the most transparency. Absolute, total commitment. You can see the camera was everywhere. In the country that in some ways is the most stable, Bosnia, we have the least access. I am like the queen of getting kicked out of Bosnian courts. I mean, it's amazing. Like, I can tell when they're about to do it. I'm like, I'm going. So I would just maybe turn to my colleagues. I think it'd be a great moment to, just to talk to us a little bit about where we are in transparency in these kinds of courts, at least from your position as legal experts.
I mean, I think there's a couple of different things that might be at play there. And one is, at least with the prosecutions that are happening in Eastern DRC, for the most part, not particularly the mobile courts, these are largely funded and facilitated by international actors also. And so there's already the engagement of outsiders. And in that way, I think that creates a bit of a door. It's much harder to sit in on a regular military tribunal hearing when there's no international interest or participation. So I think that might be part of it. And I don't know, I really mainly work in Africa, so I can't really speak to Bosnia or Colombia as much, but I feel that this issue, because of the international lens that's been put on it so much, people are expecting that there'll be international interest, and there is some receptivity and facilitation that you can count on there, because it's a newer type of these are new cases. These haven't been done before in most of the national jurisdictions, whereas I think in more developed systems, they may be a little bit more sophisticated in blocking people out, honestly. So that would be my guess as to some of what's happening in the background there.
Of course, I agree with what Kim is saying, but I do want to make the point, Steve, that Leslie, even though her filming that she was inside, it was respectful inside. It wasn't showing a face. It wasn't showing even too much of a gesture that could be used to identify the person afterwards. So I could really appreciate the ability to have access and also the ability not to reveal too much identity, which could be very harmful not only to the witness, but also to the persons who are working with the witness. And I think that in the more sophisticated courts, there's just, as most bureaucracies have, many more layers of what you can do and what you can't do and where you can film and where you can't film. And some of that is very good because they're trials and they're not considered showtimes. But I really enjoyed when you were filming in Bosnia, the discussion among the psychologists and the interpreter to really give that feeling, because the truth of it takes teams. You know, these are not Perry Mason cases where the witness walks in at the end and fall down. These are teams that have been working consistently for months, if not years. And I think you could tell by finally the confession by El Oso, he was worn down. He had understood that one of his subordinates at that point had pleaded guilty. So when someone underneath you pleads guilty and the next subordinate was coming, it was just about game over. So I think being able to take a picture of that and to keep in our minds was excellent.
You know, your point about that scene, I wish Christy Deans is the editor of this film. She's absolutely brilliant documentary editor, and we're actually going to go on and make a non-documentary together now too, so it should be interesting. But Christy worked on that scene with me, with the witness protection, the psychosocial support in Bosnia, the 3-4 folks in the room, for weeks and weeks, and we cut it and recut it and recut it. And on the surface, it's sort of like 4 people talking in a room, like whatever. But when you show that scene to anyone who has been through a case that has any component of sexual violence, they immediately get it and say, can I watch it again? And the last comment that the gentleman makes when he says, we always do, the translation, the way we used it was, and Jenna could probably tell us if we got it right, but you know, it's always the most moderate protection. So they're very conscious of not being patronizing in their protection and trying to walk the line. And they have been patronizing. They have, in fact, been incredibly patronizing. There have been any number of situations, particularly in Bosnia, where people have said, actually, I'm perfectly fine just standing up and telling you what happened because I didn't do anything wrong. And somebody else is like, oh, no, you don't have the right to do that. But these people in the Unasana Canton are endlessly trying to figure out, how do you do this in a victim-centered way, as we discussed at the UN, or folks discussed at the UN 2 weeks ago. Will we get there? I don't know.
So before we go too deep into the conversation, I think it's important to define what is actually conflict-related sexual violence, because a lot of the times when someone is being charged, or especially if they're not being charged, something that seems so obvious to us, it's because it doesn't meet a specific legal definition. So could we talk about the legal definition of conflict-related sexual violence, and then maybe more broadly, just culturally, what it means? Kim, do you want to take that first?
I'll start. I think for just a tiny primer or review, there will not be a quiz at the end, but conflict-related sexual violence means that the sexual violence has to have a nexus or relationship to an armed conflict. So I always tell my students and the prosecutors, if we don't have an armed conflict, we don't have conflict-related sexual violence. We might have something else. We might have a crime against humanity. We might have a configuration of genocide. But conflict-related sexual violence means that any act that's physical or psychological that was perpetrated against usually a certain victim or a status as a victim has to be related to an armed conflict. And then the other thing I would like to add is that conflict-related sexual violence, whether it's an international armed conflict or a non-international armed conflict, which is fancy words for civil war, can be committed by a civilian or by a military person. It doesn't have to just be a military person against a civilian. And now we're slightly getting to the point where I was very happy to see one of your scenes, that conflict-related sexual violence can be committed by a soldier against their own child soldiers within their group.
And just to add on to that, I think maybe if we try to unpack the term a little further, because it's true that conflict-related sexual violence itself is not a legal term. This is not the offense, right? It's made up of, it refers to a number of different harms. So of course we think immediately of rape, but of course we have in different tables of offenses, we have forced prostitution or forced, different types of reproductive crimes, right? The forced abortion types of crimes or forced pregnancy, different forms of enslavement that may be sexualized. It can refer to sexualized torture. So there's a whole menu of crimes that are the actual act, and what makes it conflict related, as Patty mentioned, is the context around that act. And whether this person was targeted because of their perceived role in the conflict, elements of their identity, their belief, their religion, for example, that play into the broader conflict. So we're talking about specific acts committed in a particular set of contexts, right?
You know, for those who are interested in migrating their Twitter feed, the Women's Initiative for Gender Justice right now has a wonderful initiative. Call it what it is. So on Twitter feeds that we tend to traffic in, at least, there's a lot of discussion. This is literally what is it? And I would argue, and I'm sort of looking at some of our partners who work on sexual violence more broadly in Chicago and around the world, that we as a society have a long way to go on how do we identify sexual violence writ large, not just in conflict.
And a postscript on that is the things that we normally think of as conflict-related sexual violence. We have some coherence around what we agree counts. But one thing to remember, and I think it's very important, is we know from so much data that there are other forms of sexual and gender-based violence that exist before an armed conflict, persist during the conflict, and will last and will endure and still be happening after. Those do not go away. They may be exacerbated. They may take slightly different forms. We have all the evidence you want that intimate partner violence, domestic violence, continues and affects more women in conflict-affected regions than the classic rape and pillage weapon of war rape we think about. So it's a separate conversation in a way, but we have to be careful to remember that that's affecting members of the communities we're focused on when we talk about armed conflict too.
And can we talk about some of those root causes? They're specific to various circumstances, and generally, of course, within the context of this discussion, we're talking about war and armed conflict, but there are some underlying causes for conflict-related sexual violence that we could not only make global, we could have, have a global conversation, but also locally where we live here. So can we maybe talk about some of those root causes and the foundations of that type of violence?
Yeah, I'd like to suggest a couple. If you noticed in Bosnia, one of the things that's very peculiar about the sexual violence in Bosnia, many of the cases I dealt with, is that people knew who did it. I mean, it wasn't the stranger who came over the hill and they'd never seen. I mean, if you saw twice, they pointed out where the father lives. You know, these are communities that grew up together. So it was a very unusual situation when people almost could readily identify their perpetrator or say that was someone's cousin. But why would this type of perpetrator then attack the men and women and children who were sexually violated? Root causes was patriarchy. They were in a masculine position of power during the war over females, but they were in a masculine position of power over the males who were detained and captured in these detention centers. And patriarchy played on both genders in that sense. But we might find other root causes, such as the ethnicity of the population who was vulnerable and subjected to sexual violence, or the race, or the economic background. So it's not as if the sexual violence just comes out of thin air. It's been percolated. It has reached a fertile confluence of grounds that are often structural to the society.
And there's some very interesting research on the different variation of sexual violence that happens in different armed conflicts. Because while it does happen in so many places, the way it manifests can be different, and the reasons and the forms and the specific targets, obviously. And so one of the forms of sexual violence that we see in armed conflict, more than we see in day-to-day, downtown Chicago, downtown San Francisco, is gang rape. And so, for example, when we talk about root causes, there's a scholar, Dara Cohen at Harvard, who has studied conflicts around the world where the recruitment of child soldiers is a major aspect of the conflict for some of the reasons you talk about here. So trying to replenish the forces, right? And so stealing kids from their families, abducting them from various villages, putting them together, and needing them to fight as a coherent unit. And so her theory, looking at the correlation between armed conflict where there's high rates of gang rape in particular, often overlaps with conflicts where children are forcibly recruited. And her theory is that it's because commanders need to, as efficiently as possible, bind those kids together. So how do you bind a group of 13-year-old boys together? You force them to transgress together so that their new family, the new people that they've crossed a line with, are their brothers in arms and not the family that they were stolen from. And so we have different examples of specific causes and motivations that are tied to specific types of harm, which is important to consider when we think about ways to intervene and disincentivize certain crimes.
So let's sort of talk about the legal framework for identifying and prosecuting these crimes and hopefully reaching just conclusions. Can you, maybe, Kim Tweed, talk a little bit about that legal framework, where it is, evaluate how effective this current quote-unquote regime is?
Sure. So we have, and Patty, I'm sure, will jump in because she's actually the expert on this. We have various sources of law that are relevant here, and some of them come in the form of statutes and treaties and conventions. They're written down, and so some of the legal framework for war crimes in particular will come out of the Geneva Conventions from the 1940s that followed the Second World War. But we also have, and then we have various statutes that came up and supported different tribunals. So the Yugoslav Tribunal had its own statute, the Rwanda Tribunal had its own statute. These statutes also integrated customary international law. So there's the practice over time of how states have approached certain crimes and decided to either prohibit or outright criminalize and sanction them. And so you have all this custom that also feeds into the legal framework, even though it's not written down. It can then be reflected and codified. So you have this whole stream of custom that also is relevant. And we have, I think most people are probably thinking of the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, which is a major statute for these crimes, but it's relatively recent. You know, we're talking about in the last 20 years that it's come into relevance. And so it also reflects much of the earlier statute and custom. And then another piece that might be two pieces that might be relevant too to think about. We have frameworks that are not criminal provisions, but are nonetheless relevant. So the UN Security Council resolutions on women, peace, and security really are in this tier of international instruments that remind and emphasize and try to compel states, member states, to prosecute and deal with these crimes. And so you probably heard about what happened in the Security Council a few weeks ago with the most recent resolution, and I'm sure Steve may ask about that later. But this is an attempt in a different type of international instrument to raise awareness and pressure on this issue. And then the other piece that I would mention is at the national level, we have domestic laws, which maybe a country has domesticated and is incorporating the Rome Statute into its domestic legal framework because it signed it and now has to enact it in its own laws. And those can be relevant. They can be tricky, though, because they may not map onto exactly the criminal procedural laws of that country, and the offenses may be defined differently in their penal code versus the international law-derived provisions they're adopting. So that is all to say the framework, it's there, but it's a little bit messy when you look at it closely. It still needs a little bit of translation depending where you sit, which country you're in, which tribunal.
And Patricia Sellers, you, aside from being a prosecutor in the Yugoslav tribunal and also an advisor in the Rwanda tribunals, you are a historian. And can we maybe just sort of take a big swing at this and to look at the history of this of these types of cases, and what are some of the misperceptions of what's true and what's not true?
Well, actually, I'm not a historian, but in order to practice international criminal law, I found out I better learn legal history, and that's why I can pass myself off as a historian now. So, I've studied everything back to, there's a very famous case from 1476 where there was a conviction by the not only the papal, under canon law, but under the law of what was Europe during that time period, where a Servan Hagenboth had gone into the city of Bresch and he had looted, he had raped, he had killed, and they found him guilty also of the rape. And the reason he was guilty is because he didn't put up the white flag first and say, look, you're under siege, give yourself up. And that was the rule of armed conflict. So there have been convictions for sexual violence that really date for over 500 years. And the problem isn't necessarily the law, as Kim has said. We have a lot of law. The question is the enforcement of the law. And so when you look at the legal history, I can write about the statutes, I can write about how the statutes came forward, but what I really need to write about are where are the cases that held this to be true. And after World War I, there were no big international law cases, although rape and the abduction of women and girls for the purposes of prostitution were listed as war crimes after Kaiser Wilhelm. World War II, there is plenty of sexual violence in the Tokyo judgment and a lot in the Nuremberg judgment, but you really have to dig deep. And then during World War II, there were what they call the subsequent cases. So as a historian, we're now beginning to unravel some of these subsequent cases. In 1977, we have these protocols to the Geneva Convention. So we add in rape, particularly rape of children. But what becomes very unusual is that as the feminist movement comes from this kind of second or third wave between the 60s and the 70s in most national jurisdictions, international feminist lawyers start to occupy, and I will say occupy because I believe that they were under siege, entering alien territory. International criminal law was very masculine, very military, humanitarian law. That started looking and questioning, well, where's more protection for women? Well, if the law's there, why isn't it functioning? How do we make it function? And so as we come up now, I think, to this time period with the Rome Statute and the ad hoc tribunals, we have this confluence of a modern way of looking at our laws, sometimes very good feminist critique to it, and a very good post-colonial critique that comes in. And I think that we're in the midst of this new phase of history, and these prosecutors in the movie today are right in the middle of it.
I would actually throw in, it's interesting, the film first premiered in London at the UK Foreign and Commonwealth Office, PSVI, Preventing Sexual Violence and Initiative Film Festival. Whew. And before the film, there was an appropriately heated debate between a number of scholars who were trying to decide sort of where do we as a broader advocacy movement and a research movement sit on the gender issue across the spectrum. So women have been fighting for a very long time to have these kinds of crimes identified. These crimes don't happen simply against folks who self-identify as women. They happen to people across the gender spectrum. And so how do we make our work address everyone who experiences this without losing those who still have not even gotten the basics? And I'm thinking 2 weeks ago when we talked about reproductive health at the UN, and the United States decided to weigh in on what reproductive health care would look like at the new UN resolution. Not very much is what they decided it would look like, for men or women. So I think that there's an interesting gender feminism conversation that's going to continue to be had around this, which is appropriate.
I want to bounce back to that. Earlier we had before we came out here, we had a discussion about the UN resolution that Germany put forward that was watered down by the United States. And Patricia, you said that it's very important that we fully understand about reproductive health as something that's just as important from the male as than a female perspective. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. I think that there is such a tendency, and it might be a national framework, to hear the word reproductive health and we say, oh, that's code word. They're really talking about abortion. When you look at reproductive health as it's related to conflict-related sexual violence, you have to put yourself, and I hope you don't physically have to do it, but mentally put yourself in the position of someone who might have been in a detention camp or being occupied in their own home area, or being in the way of a militia. And what type of medical or reproductive care might a 13-year-old who's been raped 18 times a day need? She might need to have an operation on her vagina and fistula. She might also have to be followed for many years because of HIV infections to know whether she could ever have a child or not. Someone might have to check just in terms of her psychological, social psychological development related to that. Should she be covered? And then when you think of a boy child who's been a boy soldier, who's been raped anally, probably orally several times, and you think that there's usually some form of penile mutilation that goes along with child rape, particularly of boys, and that they have problems usually in holding their feces for large parts of their life. That's how most of the male sexual assault victims are identified in some refugee camps. And then you step back and say, okay, reproductive health. What are we talking about? We're talking about such a broad spectrum of health care that follows you along the sexuality of your life. And one of the reasons I think this is key and critical, and it's not necessarily the topic of tonight. Tonight we're talking about war crimes, and we're not talking about genocide. And the international crime of genocide, its underlying basis is to make sure one group no longer has the capacity to reproduce, that it dies out. And so to ignore the reproductive health of sexual assault victims that are related to war or crimes against humanity somewhere plays into notions, I would think, of genocide. I'm not saying they're the same, but I'm saying they're related.
Kim Tweed?
Yeah, thanks. The language in that resolution that was struck it's also sexual and reproductive health rights, right? And so to add on to, Patty's really illustrating the reproductive aspect of it, but if you think also about sexual rights and your rights to bodily integrity and sexual integrity, if you think about, I don't know how many of you have worked with survivors of sexual violence before. I, for my part, have represented men, women, kids for many years, and the psychological impact and the self-questioning, the doubt that many people experience, had male clients who could no longer, they couldn't have relations with their wives anymore, which not only affected quite literally their ability to reproduce, but just their sexual integrity, like their whole sense of self was completely diminished and inverted. It affects, of course, then their spouse, their partner, it affects the kids, it affects so many people around them, and if they, the irony about this whole resolution, which has made us, it's almost laughable, except it's very dire, is that the impetus was to create a resolution that would advocate and emphasize the need for a survivor-centered approach to this crime. This was the main impetus behind Germany's bringing it forward to begin with. And so when you strike that language, it means that you have no appreciation or respect for the type of healthcare services that people need. Even before they may be interested in investigation, prosecution, any of the accountability efforts, the first thing folks want to know is, am I sick? Do I need repair? How is this going to affect the way I feel and think about myself going forward? And so in a way, like we spoke about this morning, it was such a hollow and petty victory for the U.S. to threaten veto on this. We have that language in prior resolutions, right? We can borrow from that. We can advocate for what comprehensive health care means. So it was pure pettiness, I think, and it made us look even smaller than I think we do on the world stage by really using the threat of a veto, which is incredibly serious, for something. Is this the hill we want to die on, really, as a foreign policy priority? It was a little bit, I really, as I said this morning, I felt quite embarrassed.
We just have a few minutes left, and then we're going to take questions from all of you. First, what are we getting right? What are some of the hopeful spots that you see that gives you hope that we're moving in the right direction? Or are we?
Well, I think we're moving in the right direction. I mean, the fact that you're out here tonight and no one has left during our talk so far, okay? And that we've already reached a point, we've crossed some type of threshold where all of us have a common understanding that rape or sexual violence during war isn't collateral damage. I don't think we could have had that conversation 30 or 35 years ago. So I think that in itself is a partial victory. And the other part of that victory is that now we expect someone to adjudicate or investigate those crimes. And so that's part of the positiveness for me.
And I think the fact that we have now 9 Security Council resolutions addressing this squarely, we have international protocols that address the specific ways you can investigate and document this crime. We have more and more prosecutions at the national level, like Leslie has shown us, and this is where really my interest is. It's how do folks on the ground in resource-limited settings with no background of war crimes prosecutions, how do they do this for the first time? What works in that context? And we're seeing more than that. We've had victories, right? We've had a successful prosecution in Guatemala in the Sepuzarco case. We just convicted the former president of Chad in the courts of Senegal a year and a half ago on appeal that was confirming the underlying conviction. So we're making progress in different fora, which I think is very encouraging. And as Patty said, was inconceivable even 2 or 3 decades ago.
So my final question for all three of you. So Leslie, you've done this incredible movie. You both are trailblazers in your fields. Why should someone walking up and down Michigan Avenue care about these instances halfway across the world? And secondly, what can we do once we leave this room?
I'll take a first stab at the first question first, if that's okay. I think people care, I think, as you all are evidence, because we know that this is happening, and it's deeply disturbing. But I think part of it is tied to what you mentioned, Steve, and the underlying causes of this. They're common. I mean, gender inequality, right, and deprivation and the need for domination. These are parts of the human condition sometimes, it seems, and we see manifestations of gender inequality here in Chicago, in New York, in San Francisco. The way women and girls and then men also have been sort of, I think, targeted by this type of crime. It's not alone. It's not only in DRC and in Bosnia, and it manifests in different ways in different places. But I think one thing that occurred to me that we don't speak and make the connection too clearly about, but this has affected so many people. The connection between these crimes and forced displacement is quite clear, and we have huge refugee communities here in Chicago and different parts of the United States, for example. And some portion of those folks who have fled have been affected by this type of crime, either directly or because of a family member or it was happening in their communities. And until we understand it more fully, I think that we're unable to offer the right support services or understand what qualifies for asylum or really support them in the ways that they need to in resettlement. So those are some of the things that I feel are present with us when we walk down Michigan Avenue or Market Street.
Right. I think it's a good question. Why should we care? You know, I don't have to go to Bosnia on any given day. But I think the film illustrates, but we know on a very human gut level, that without eliminating this sexual violence, whether it be an armed conflict or whether it be outside across the street in the park, our communities are not at peace. Women are not at peace at night when they walk out in the city. The reason that it's important that the Security Council is now looking at conflict-related sexual violence is because the Security Council, one of their jobs is to tell us about when there's been a breach in the peace or how to maintain the peace or restoration. I mean, they're supposed to tell us if there's been a disturbance in the force. And I think sexual violence, wherever it happens, whether it's in our institutions, whether it's in our churches, whether it's in our football clubs, whether it's in our parking lots, shows that there is a disturbance in the peace. And those are among the reasons I think we should care.
Like she said, I think that we have no sustainable, durable peace without addressing sexual violence in any format against anyone. So it is incumbent upon us. I would like to answer that we should care because we should, but it doesn't always work that way. But we don't really have a choice, and so we need to do this work.
Leslie Thomas is the founding executive director and board member of Artworks Projects for Human Rights. She's also the director, co-producer, and co-editor of the film The Prosecutors. Kim Twee Seelinger is the director of the Sexual Violence Program at the Human Rights Center at Berkeley. And Patricia Visur Sellers is the special advisor for gender Office of the Prosecutor for the International Criminal Court. Thank you all so much, and thank you to the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. Some years ago, they told me that they wanted to up their game, and they really did with this event. Thank you all so much.
We're going to have some questions.
So, we're going to take questions now, and will there be a microphone or, okay, sure. So just raise your hand, and the woman in the back, please.
Hi, good evening. My name is Kimberly Brown. I'm an Obama Scholar at the University of Chicago, and I'm a human rights lawyer who's worked across sub-Saharan Africa on sexual gender-based violence and institutional strengthening with national governments. I have a question, and I think, Professor Sellers, you hit the nail on the head when you were talking about the persistence of sexual and gender-based violence in communities as a whole. So long as it persists, there is no peace. And one thing that concerns me, having worked in the international criminal justice space and then at the domestic context, is the different focus and the different energy and resources that are put on regular, if I call them that, not that any case is regular, but the typical cases where someone might not be involved, it might not be a case of conflict, where they might have this global or regional attention on those specific cases. And you're seeing this kind of emergence of best practices that are coming out of these cases, whether domestic or regional or international. But there's still, even here in the US, here in Chicago, real challenges in terms of establishing how do we, from beginning to end, gathering evidence, providing psychosocial support for survivors from beginning till end, protecting the evidence throughout the process, all of that. How do we make sure that we're trickling and replicating these processes within the national context and within the kind of typical cases in a way that resonates more strongly, and because that's, for me, I think, the million-dollar question at the end of the day, because I think that's how we begin to, when those two worlds more closely speak to each other, that's when I think a lot of the change can happen more quickly, because they'll ebb and flow, hopefully, into each other to bring about quicker, meaningful change for communities around the world on sexual violence. Thank you.
That was a comment, not a question, right? Oh, well, I think that basically the national prosecution are the links. And the international criminal work being done at the national prosecution really allows us to see whether the best standards from international courts can be applied and where they shouldn't be applied, where maybe there's a difference. But also, one does not necessarily look at sexual violence that is not committed by, but where a leader such as Karadzic will be responsible for. So, for example, Karadzic, the appeal chamber just confirmed his conviction for sexual violence as a crime against humanity and war crime. But basically, the underlying evidence was more than hundreds of sexual assault witnesses. And so to understand that procedural-wise, there might be a different manner in presenting that evidence than one would at a national court, where the person might have to come in if it was a lower ranking commander or perpetrator.
And I would add that I think part of the challenge is it's the numerosity, right? When we're talking about day-to-day cases, there's so many more than the actual international crimes cases that will ever see the light of day. Underreporting is an issue on both sides, of course, but I think at least where when I spend a lot of time working with national police officers and judges and prosecutors in East and West Africa, the only reason we see any resources or services allocated in the international crimes cases is because there's only one or two of those cases, and the international donors are providing that, or civil society is bearing the burden of the psychosocial support, of the witness protection. The states largely are not providing very much, and it's just a handful of cases because they're going for mid-high-level commanders. The number of sort of regular, in quotes, as you say, rape cases, for example, they're coming through the criminal justice system in Uganda, for example. They're not getting that many support services for those victims, but it's because there's not investment generally, and the only investment is because on the international crime side, it's because there's some foreign donors usually who are putting in just for that, and they don't expect many more cases than that. So that's a little bit bleak, but I think the disparity isn't as stark as, in my experience, as your description, at least in Uganda, because I don't see very much support on either side there. I think the professionalization, you see more specialized units developing for police and prosecutors for sex crimes, and slowly for war crimes and international crimes generally too. And it may also be a function of international attention on one type of crime rather than the other that is bringing money to those teams. But again, it's finite because the number of cases is small, right?
We're also taking questions from people who are watching our live stream, and I have a question here. How does a victim survivor's gender, man or woman, affect the prosecutorial process and the likelihood of conviction? Patricia?
I think it's a very good question. In some ways, each sexual assault survivor or / victim has a type of unique story and experience that they lived. But the differentiation I have seen in some cases between males and females within the Yugoslav tribunal, there were over 19 cases where males were among the primary victims. And it's very interesting. Very few people follow those cases, write about those cases. There's still something hard to fathom about all of that male sexual violence. And in the movie today, when the prosecutor, Yasmin, was talking about the children, the men, and the women, what we've witnessed in Bosnia, 20 years later, there are many more males coming forward than ever came forward in the first 10 years. Compared to women, men take a longer time. And part of it could be for reasons of patriarchy. But some male victims might exhibit the difference in behavior of often their depression turns outward into violence, to anger, to sometimes alcohol or drug abuse, or to this this type of deeply self-inflicted physical harm, whereas women can tend to, and it's a broad generalization, become very depressed for life and just try to survive each day. They don't necessarily become abusive people. They don't necessarily become addicted to substances. And that's one of the broad general differences I've seen. But this might change. We know that in the Syrian context that there is a lot of male sexual violence that's becoming much more public. And maybe because there'll be attention to that and services to that, there might be a different reaction in the long run. Maybe
to add, one of the other potential distinctions or differences that we've observed is, as Patty mentioned, different rates of underreport. People disclose for different reasons, and a lot of At times we have women who come forward not because they want to pursue an investigation, but because they need medical care, because they want to make sure they're not pregnant, right? Or if they are pregnant, they want to make sure they didn't just contract HIV, which is going to go into the fetus. And so women have different reasons sometimes, and the services are available. And it's in going to those services, the medical services, that they get referral to then report to the police. So the entryway into the judicial process is a little bit clearer for women, whereas for men, there are like zero services for the most part. And male survivors that we've worked with and that my colleagues in Uganda say have worked with, it's not, I mean, they're physically destroyed and psychologically destroyed, but there's almost nowhere they know to go. And the different types of stigma that can impede reporting for men make it, additionally hard. And so when you have different points of disclosure that can affect the number of clients and the type of evidence you can collect at a certain time. And then the other thing I would mention, and Patty can correct me if I'm wrong, but also oftentimes the way sexual violence against men is characterized and charged can be a little bit different because of how either we see it or how they see it. And so often you'll see, rape in detention called torture more frequently when it's a man. And so sometimes there are differences in the charging, or the initial charging anyway.
I just want to really quickly say, for those interested in learning more about this and advocating or finding partners on this, the new All Survivors organization is doing fantastic work. They sort of evolved out of UCLA. You can find them on the internet. And they're doing quite a bit of work globally to make sure that this conversation addresses all aspects of male sexual violence and conflict.
And then to add, and the Refugee Law Project in Kampala also, which has been around for decades and been doing this for a very long time.
You semi-answered my question, but back to Steve's question, which is what can we do besides listening to Worldview on WBEZ, attending these programs at the council? Are there other organizations like the ones you just mentioned that we can get involved in, try to spread awareness? What else can we do?
I was kicking myself at the last question of the previous segment because I completely forgot to mention something that's so obvious. And I think regardless of, just because I'm coming here from San Francisco, I'm not going to make any assumptions about the politics of anyone in this room, but I think it's incumbent upon all of us to, if we care about this issue, we have to vote. We have to make sure that we can't sell survivors down the river in the Security Council again. I think this is kind of a bipartisan thing. I think I can't, my Democrat friends, my Republican friends, we all really are disturbed by this form of violence, and we should all be making sure that we express those views to our representatives, our senators, make sure that foreign policy can't be hijacked to strip away. We didn't get into the details, but our administration has stripped the funding for social services in refugee camps. We have this gag rule for any sort of reproductive health care that might at all mention contraception, abortion, things like this, right? We've taken funding away for the research and the services that need to happen in humanitarian crises. We have so much money that we have traditionally spent on supporting survivors that we're not using. It's being siphoned away now. And these are things that we can help move the dial a little bit on if we just activate ourselves as citizens, I think.
I would also just add, I'm going to jump in there on the advocate side. Our organization, Artworks Projects for Human Rights, and my colleague Annalise Flynn-Taylor is over here as well, and there are several board members in the room. We have partnered over the last 6 years with dozens of incredible organizations, all known to these two and many that I've met around the world, and we'll be doing that for the next foreseeable years. In using the film to do these things. There is a lot that can move the lever. Almost all of the things that we're talking about are related to policy, funding, voting, and so forth. So yes, the problem may feel intractable, but it's actually not, and addressing it is definitely not. I'm happy to talk to you afterwards.
We talked about a full spectrum of services as well as root causes for conflict and sexual assault during conflict. What is being done to address the stigma and the culture and kind of patriarchy and root causes?
Well, if I could say something, we have to understand that we're the holders of the stigma, we the people. Okay? And it's this stigma that's being imposed by the state via us, by our being uncomfortable to understand how everyday this is. And so if we decide not to hold that stigma against someone, then we can't falsely congratulate them for breaking the silence. I think we have to break our own silence. In the work that I've seen, many women and many men don't talk about the state won't let me talk. They'll talk about societal pressure. They'll talk about their families. Okay, so that stigma and that holding of a stigma is much closer to the victim or survivor than some amorphous state. And that's something we can do. And we do it with domestic sexual assault victims to let them know that they don't have to be quiet so that we'll feel better.
And just an illustration of this, there's finally been more conversation about a population, an affected population that's been largely invisible, but it's the children who can be born of wartime rape. And this is something that's so obvious, but it's really in recent years that this has become a little more pronounced in sort of the policy discussion and research. And I think that for all of its flaws and the problems that we had in this recent resolution of the Security Council, it is very explicit about sort of ending and addressing the stigma that can obstruct the rights and the health of children who come into the world because of this violation. And so I think that that's a helpful start also to actually at the Security Council level say, we see you and we understand your rights are compromised by the circumstances of your birth, and we'll try to dismantle those barriers. So that is one forward step, I think.
I think we have time for 2 quick questions.
Hi, I had a question. If you had, in your experiences in various countries, ever seen a tension between the truth and reconciliation movements and sort of amnesty movements after a civil war, and the idea of holding perpetrators accountable for the crimes that they committed during those wars?
Yeah, we were just talking about this before coming out. There is a tension, and I'll just speak from one particular example. I know that Leslie and Patty have others, but I spent a lot of time in Uganda, as I mentioned, and the war crimes case they're trying right now is against Thomas Quayle, who, it's a long and tortured case, has many problems, but one of the initial issues was why he had not been granted amnesty, whereas many similarly situated combatants from his exact same Lord's Resistance Army had been granted amnesty. And so I think amnesty is so important for transitional justice purposes, and it can provide reconciliation in a way that accountability itself can't sometimes. But there are exceptions to what can be sort of forgiven or addressed in these ways. And so in his particular case, this was a big problem because he, in a very convoluted Supreme Court decision, was denied the right to amnesty and is now facing trial for something that I think some people have mixed feelings about this trial because it's not clear whether he should have been singled out for non-amnesty. And it is a problem, and I don't think that we have a neat answer. There may be other traditional justice ways that local communities want to deal with many, many crimes and violations, but there is a category of crimes that I think there's large-scale agreement that cannot be resolved in that way.
Just very briefly, that war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide have no statute of limitations. There was a treaty on that in 1969 to say we will not recognize a statute of limitations. That's why you could set up a tribunal and go back and prosecute what happened at the Cambodian War. And among the reasons that there's no statute of limitations is that these are considered our highest values, our highest international law values: prevent genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. So it's kind of ironic that very high-level value and no statute of limitations can be underwritten by a political decision in a country of amnesty. So that's part of the tension. And what we find is that whether it's amnesty that's legal or in practice, that it's often amnesty about the sexual violence. Just think about Afghanistan today. which crimes might be amnestied away or conveniently forgotten given the patriarchal nature of the society? Is this what we want?
Well, thank you all. So Patricia and Kim Twee are up here, and if you have any questions, I'm sure they'd be happy to speak with you. I want to thank our host, the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, for making their Robert R. McCormick Foundation Hall available to us for this special night. Thank you all very much.